And you participated, obviously, in the famous Selma to Montgomery marches in 1965. At what level? I've read, for example, that you became involved, not at a command level, but you started kind of issuing instructions and organizing people almost as of nature.
Well, before I met Dr. King, coming out of my own childhood experience in the NAACP and working with James Farmer from CORE, Reverend Floyd McKissick from CORE, NAACP. We were inspired by Dr. King, but he was operating kind of on the Atlanta, Alabama side. We were kind of on the Greensboro side. And so it was that I left jail in Greensboro, where I went to school, North Carolina A&T, and went to the March on Washington. I was just a face in the crowd wearing all of the credentials of having been in the jail. We put honor and dignity in the jail cell. If you didn't go to jail, something was wrong with you. You got your stars from your scars. And so we left, and my football coach was good enough to do what coaches ordinarily don't do, except my missing the first week of practice to go to the march. He knew I was very caught up in the march. And so that was 6-3. And we kept marching. I went to University of Chicago in 6-4, Chicago Theological Seminary. And I was kind of going either to law school or seminary, and I went away, and Dr. Sam Proctor, my college president, said, seminary may be more valuable for what you were doing, even in law, which I couldn't imagine at that time. The point is that while I was away kind of for a year, but working in Chicago organizing, I was not connected to Dr. King at that time. The Sunday of the Selma March, I mean the confrontation Sunday, when the blood began to flow, he asked seminaries and students to join him in Alabama. We drove all the way to Alabama that night, and that's where I first met him as a worker. I began to work for his staff shortly after, and that was 1965.
And were you ever attracted to some of the more muscular or militant elements of the resistance, black resistance movement in the 60s, groups like the Black Panthers, for example? Did it cross your mind that there was an alternative to passive resistance, and perhaps that might be the way?
Now, we were convinced that going to jail was militant, and it had the power to build our community at the same time. It was very clear to me that threatening the military with a gun, and they had the most guns, you didn't make guns and I'll make bullets, that was not the way to move the society. And I didn't consider that militant nor attractive. I did on one occasion, however, reading a book, and the word is given by Louis Lomax about Malcolm X, go to New York to meet Malcolm. And he was not there the weekend I was there. I don't know what would have happened had I met him, but it was his sense of the discipline, organizing of black consciousness that appealed to me. But when that was over, I went back to A&T and finished our work. But it was always clear that Dr. King's mass discipline action could get results. I learned how to do boycotts and withdrawal campaigns and consumer campaigns, and later began to connect with the labor movement within the context of working with him. So that was my main attraction.
Famously, you were with Dr. King on the day of his assassination. What are your memories of that day?
We were, preparing to do a Poor People's Campaign. He said, we now have public accommodations. We can use it in a hotel, motel, park, or library. We now, by the time, we now have the right to vote. But there is this rising poverty. And money is designed for the war on poverty. We shifted the war in Vietnam. We're killing, we should be healing. The budget is a moral document, and our country has lost its way. It was in that context that we were organizing the Poor People's Campaign. I shall never forget the weekend before we went to Memphis, because he was under violent attack for taking on the war. That's before we globalized our consciousness. and to move from civil rights to anti-war was like considered an act of treason. It certainly was a bold act. He said, I know during the war time is difficult because, but I cannot betray my conscience through silence. He spoke out against the war April 4th, 1967, a year to the day he was killed. And so he said on Friday, he called us to a meeting in Atlanta, and he had Dr. Abernathy to call his friend. And we were reluctant to come because we were all doing other projects around the country for him. And so I remember Dr. Abernathy said, catch a 7 o'clock plane. So we really didn't want to go because I was doing breadbasket and economic development in Chicago. So I said, Dr. Abernathy, we just missed the plane. He said, yeah, that was a 7:30 when I knew you were going to miss the first one. So we went on to Atlanta. And we got there, and he came in the meeting and said, I've been with Ralph and Anna for about 3 days. I have a migraine headache. I'm under attack from every hand. Many of my own classmates now attack me. Pulpits are closed to me. Doors are locked in my face. We're not going to turn around. He said, you know, I thought about quitting. Maybe I've done as much as I can do in 13 years. But now we won the Montgomery bus boycott. We have public accommodations. We have the right to vote. We have open housing. Maybe I've done as much as I can do. He said, then I thought maybe if I would fast and pray. So I remember Andy Young saying, Dr. King, don't talk that way. He said, Andy, don't say peace, peace, when there is no peace. I know what I'm going through. He said, I thought if maybe our movement is divided, if I would fast and pray to the point of death, that my friends, Snick, Stokely, and Rap Brown, and Fort McKissick, and Farmer, we could all at least come together, at least we're friends, but we may disagree philosophically or tactically. He then said, you know, but we're going to turn the minus into a plus. We're going on. Like he talked himself out of a depression with that last point. And I was taking copious notes earlier that morning, and I could not help but think the 3 phases was Jesus saying, let this cup pass from me. Maybe I should quit. And then the next statement was, as he prayed, some disciples fell asleep, as we did early that Saturday morning. And then, not my will, but thine be done. It's almost the same kind of poetic parallel to that. And we went on to, around that Tuesday or Wednesday, to Memphis. The march before, some saboteurs, inspired by the government, had undercut the march with violence on the end of it as a way of discrediting his leadership. He could not lead in more nonviolent movements. And so it was in that context we were there, and I went to that day of the 4th, he talked about his family, how his father met his mother, and how his father got to church. He kind of walked through his whole family history. And the night before April 3rd, it was, that after talking that day, April 3rd, all about this, if I might say, he said, Jess, I want you to go and speak for me tonight. And I couldn't come up with a thought, you know. So I'll go if Reverend Abernathy would go. He said, well, you, Ralph, you guys go. I don't feel like going that night. We got to the church, and it was thundering and lightning, and the church had a tin top. And I remember when we walked in the door, 1,000, 2,000 people stood up screaming. So Reverend Abernathy said, they're not screaming for us. They think Martin is behind us. It's not us. It's not about us. They're screaming. So we went to the back of the church and called him and said, Doc, you have to come, even if you don't stay long. So I'll come. So when he came to church, there's a picture of me talking to him, debriefing him on what had happened. And so he took his time and walked through the history of our struggle, the mountaintop speech, and referenced our work with Breadbasket in that speech. And that was the mountaintop speech. And we had no way of knowing the kind of pressures he was under, of what he knew intuitively. We didn't know that. And the next day, we spent much of that day in the room talking through strategies. And that afternoon around 6, we were on the way to Reverend Billy Kyle's home for dinner. And we had a singing group we had brought down from a band from Chicago. I was walking across the courtyard, and he said, Jesse, we're running a little late. You don't have on a tie. We're going to Reverend Kyle's home for dinner. And I said, Dr. King, a tie is not a prerequisite for eating. You need an appetite. He let me say, you're crazy. And he leaned over to a friend of ours who's in the car and said, be sure to play my song, Precious Lord, which she'd heard in Chicago 2 weeks before. And the Rizback said, dop, dop, and the bullet hit him in the neck. And I heard someone, I think Reverend Bell was saying, get low. Because whoever it was, if they had scattered, it had gotten all of us, you know. I remember going toward the steps and he was lying there. I remember Reverend Abernathy coming out saying, he's my friend, let me get to him, let me get to him. And I got up and walked to the phone and called Mrs. King and said, I think Dr. King has been shot in the shoulder. I could not really say what I saw. But I think you should get over as quick as you can. She was by her bed. And I think within 5 minutes, the Associated Press had called her and said he had been killed. So that was very traumatic. But what hit my mind was that we could not let one bullet kill a whole movement. So when we gathered together, we determined to go on to Washington. We determined we would keep our focus on the Poor People's Campaign. We would focus on in the war. And so we didn't spend a lot of time, frankly, going back and forth to Memphis trying to find out much about the killer. We didn't spend a lot of time trying to prosecute the guy or the guys, as it may have been. We spent our time going on to build a resurrection city, which was a kind of a place for our poor people's organization. He determined that this, I might say, on his birthday, which is just 3 months prior, that he said that we must now organize this campaign. He said it must be multiracial. You're not going to have full employment on one side of town for blacks, unemployment for whites and Latinos. So in that birthday meeting, the morning how he spent his birthday was around 8 o'clock. He had breakfast with his family. Around 10, he came and had some whites from Appalachia, working class poor white people, and some Latinos, some of Chavez's group out in Colorado and California, some Jewish allies out of New York, Al Lowenstein's group, some blacks from deep South Georgia, some labor leaders. And we met that morning trying to organize a march to Washington. We would, in great numbers, as in Egypt, if you will, go to Washington, preparing to go to jail, to engage in civil disobedience, to put a focus on jobs and justice, health care, and poverty for all. He made the case that there should be a floor beneath which no one should fall. If you keep spending huge amounts of money on buttressing the welfare and on the military and no money left for the poor, it's moral bankruptcy. It's spiritual bankruptcy. We were preparing that day, that march, and he spent that morning lecturing on tactics. Around noontime, someone brought in a cake and said, Doc, you forgot it's your own birthday, Mrs. Anona Clayton, and we ate the cake and drank the punch. And Al Lowenstein spent the rest of the afternoon on how to end the war. So he spent his own last birthday, A, at home with family, B, in the basement of church, blue jeans, work clothes on, how to end poverty, a major celebration, how to end the war. So those who were there celebrate his birthday. In his tradition, it would be a working day to focus on ending poverty, jobs, justice, and ending wars, and redirecting budget priorities.
1984, just to fast forward a little bit, why did you decide to run for the Democratic presidential nomination? Did you think that you could win, or were you trying to make a point?
At first, it was a protest, it was a point. We were campaigning for change in Chicago, seemingly not getting very far. And 3 of our colleagues were arrested trying to challenge the unfairness and inequality in public housing. And we were able to get them out of jail. Someone called to me on the radio on a Sunday morning and said, they're getting to have this big Chicago fest of free food and artists, Stevie Wonder and all these artists are coming. You guys should boycott it. It's just Jane Burns, the mayor's coronation. You should boycott it. I cannot imagine rational how to boycott a concert that's free with Odetta and Stevie Wonder and the OJs and free rides and beer and hot dogs. But my faith said, but nothing is too hard for God. If it's right, it's worth the fight. And so we met that Wednesday and declared we're going to organize a boycott of the Chicago Fest called Enough is Enough. And we began to picket for about 10 days. And each day, a different artist would say, I'm not going to cross the picket line. They give us momentum. So we urged Harold Washington, please run for mayor. Harold said, I'm not inclined. I have a good job in Congress. I don't want to stop. But if I run, if there's one candidate, through some process, you put $250,000 on the table, and I can have 80% of the black vote, but 50 plus one Latino vote, by 10% of the white vote, that coalition, we can win on those conditions. And so it was in that way of organizing that we were going to put on the table a civil rights and labor and justice coalition. Somewhere we heard that Ted Kennedy and Walter Mondale were going to come to Chicago, support Daley and James Brown. We couldn't imagine these were our liberal allies. I mean, Ted Kennedy and Mondale. And so we sent them a telegram with like 100 names on it. Willie Brown, state legislator, Mrs. King. Said, please don't come. We can. This is a Democratic primary. We're allies. And they said to us, but these are our friends. Wow. Then what are we? If that's how we're treated when it comes time to power sharing. So I said, someone needs to run for president, at least in the primary. And I tried to get Maynard Jackson, former mayor of Atlanta, to run, because he had the credentials. He had been a deputy mayor, he had been mayor, he had a lawyer, he had all the right credentials, and very particular able guy. And he said, I don't want to do it now because I'm regrouping the deals with my family. And I tried to get Andy Young to run, and they had the credentials. He had been the congressman ambassador, he wouldn't do it. And so I kept arguing someone had to do it. Somewhere along the way, I heard the cry, run, Jesse, run. And I felt if I did not run at that time to open up the process, that it would be as if I had been playing with the people and I was not serious. And so we just kind of kept the process going. So we had to, that time around, we had to learn as we went. But because we had been, I was 84, I've been organizing since 1960, so we had deep roots in a lot of churches, a lot of places, and we were able to build that moment into a progressive movement. And the rainbow came from the fact that I would go to the Democratic Convention and there were Native Americans out fighting for sovereignty and Latinos fighting for bilingual education and other groups, labor fighting to be recognized. There were more folk outside the convention than inside. And I said, this is a multiracial, this is a rainbow coalition, a multiracial group of people. And that's where the name came from. And we ran, had our bumps along the way. We learned a lot that time around and built the most massive coalition for change we'd ever known. And it was outside the party. The parties tried to snuff it out. Matter of fact, they set up something called the Democratic Leadership Council to offset. Their idea was to regain lost white males. Ours was to get new and younger voters to join a movement for change. That was a kind of tension. And I might say in '88 we ran the second time. I noticed that we had far more popular votes than delegates. So we fight for something called proportionality, because on the old system, if I get 49.9, you get 50.1, you get all, winner take all. The rule Republicans use even to this day. We said that's bad math. You should get proportionality. Based upon winning that proportionality argument, we reduced the threshold from 45% to 35% to 15% and got proportionality. In the last election, fast forward 20 years later, Hillary Clinton won California barely. She won Texas barely. She won Ohio and Pennsylvania barely. But on the old system, she would have been the winner. He would have been a loser. But the groundwork we laid in the '88 campaign changed the rules. We democratized democracy and helped lay the groundwork for the changes that we now see taking place.
I mean, there was a huge difference between in '84, you did well. You won 21% of the popular vote in the primary campaign. Walter Mondale won. You won 5 primaries and caucuses. In '88, you more than doubled against Dukakis. You more than doubled your popular vote. You won 11 primaries and caucuses. You were actually the front runner at one point, I think, until Wisconsin, which you were expected to win. What was the difference between '84 and '88?
Democratic Party panicked. They started an Anybody But Jesse campaign, ABJ campaign, because the idea of an African American winning, they could not imagine that happening. But they were behind the cultural progress of the people. I remember our group saying, don't campaign on our way is you know, 99%, 98% white. So wait and spend your time in urban America where you have a vote. I said, if you don't run in Iowa, you don't have legitimacy as a national candidate. And we beat Mundell and Gephardt in Iowa. We ran among the farmers, arguing for the family farmer, and the Teamsters, and the working poor and labor. So our goal was to get double digits, but we did not have a budget. We didn't have any money. We ran on the strength of relationships, knowing people, and arguing our public case. And so the difference really was, by '88, there was a certain preparation for our running. I mean, we won Vermont, a state that's virtually all white. We won Michigan. We came in first and second in 44, 45 campaigns. And therefore, we could begin to see the impact of a new America emerging. And I think much of the groundwork had been laid by entertainers who draw crowds across lines of race and religion and region. Much of it laid by athletic events where people begin to choose uniform color, not skin color, and direction, not complexion. It's like the socializing of the country was taking place. I remember talking with President Barack one time. He said he was a student. We went to debate with Mondale and Hart at Columbia University. And he saw the debate and he said, this can happen. He was a student. And part of our mission was to lay the groundwork with the sow seeds so it could happen. And of course in '88, we made these breakthroughs. And by 1992, when Clinton ran, those new voters that we'd pull on, neither Labor nor Democrats elected registered blacks in the South. You wouldn't register black in the South because they threatened white Democrats in the South. Labor had little interest in the South, but we brought on those new votes, and they redefined the framework of the campaign. So Bush and Dole got more white votes than Clinton. He got more white, black, and brown because his base was broader and more multicultural than their base. So the 88-48 campaign laid the groundwork for Clinton's victories, and really Gore won but lost in 2000. And by 2008, of course, we have the results that we have in President Obama.
2008, from a personal perspective, I was in the wrong place at the wrong time. I was in Arizona, watching, not much further away than I am from you, watching McCain make his speech in which he was accepting defeat, and then went in to my hotel room to watch the speech from Grant Park, that famous victory speech. You were clearly emotional. There were quite a number of TV cutaways, and there were cutaways to you which suggested that you were emotional. I mean, it must have been a wonderful moment for you in particular.
When I looked up at the board and saw that he had won, two things struck me. One, we were in that same park 40 years earlier, the Democratic Convention fighting against the war, and we were being tear gas in that same Grant Park 40 years earlier. But as he was coming out, it was the joy of the moment and the journey. The joy of the moment he had won, but I looked around, the people who laid the groundwork for his winning were not there. Many were dead, many were too poor to come there. They couldn't have been standing where I was standing. And I thought about Bloody Sunday. On that Sunday, when the confrontation occurred, there were no PhDs on that march, there were no professors on that march. There were no ministers of major churches. Dr. King himself was in Atlanta that Sunday morning. There were no movie stars on that march. A guy named Cotton Reader, just a kind of basic guy. A guy named Sunshine, nickname. A guy named George James Orange, Mrs. Boynton, kind of hardworking, nameless, faceless, everyday people. They took the hit, and yet they had no place for their night. And then I thought about Medgaver's funeral and Dr. King's funeral. And I wish that just for a moment in time, they could have seen the fruits of their work. It really belonged to them. The media, many of them saw President Barack Obama as coming down unilaterally with some new phenomena. He did not come down this way, he came this way. From the 40 campaign to desegregate the military, to put pressure on Truman, the 54 decision to make apartheid illegal as a matter of law, the 55 boycott, the 55 to 64 sit-ins, the SIP public accommodation bill, the right to vote, the open housing drives, the opening up of the schools, the 84-88 campaigns. President Barack ran the last lap. He ran the great last lap, as great fast runners do, of a 60-year campaign. But the people who had made that night possible for the most part could not be there. And this was their night. The pressure for Truman to desegregate the military didn't come from the parties. The pressure, the Montgomery bus boycott was not led by either party. Matter of fact, George Wallace was a Democrat. The March on Washington was not led by any party. It's what I call the third rail. You know, some of these train systems, you have the two tracks and you have the third rail where the heat is. And it's the activist movement that provides the heat, the energy to make the train run. And so I'm fairly clear that the party moves by the energy of the third rail. So I am impressed with the fact that we now have proportionality, resulting in part President Barack's victory. Impressed by the fact that our party is very multiracial and multicultural in its basic makeup. It looks more like America. I'm impressed with that. On the other hand, fast forward to today, I am disappointed in some of its priorities. We are now celebrating the great revolution with democracy in Egypt. The first act New Republican Congress did was to change the rules so citizens of D.C., the nation's capital, cannot have a voice or a vote in the Congress. More people live in Washington than 19 states that have 38 senators. And yet taxation, not representation, I heard, is key to the democracy. And yet neither party really fights for D.C.'s right to vote. Democrats on record for it, but it's not a vigorous fight. Even when they was in charge of all three branches of government, it was not a vigorous fight. They voted to deny the voice or vote to Puerto Rico, Guam, the Virgin Islands, and the Mariana Islands. So I was disappointed in that. I'm glad we won in 2008 because of the battles that we fought against great resistance. For example, what was not commonly known today is that when President Barack came in, we were losing 800,000 jobs a month. We hemorrhaged, the economy was going out the back door. He was able to get a modest stimulus, for which he was attacked for getting it, to stop the hemorrhage and to save 3 million and create 3 million jobs. It did not correspond with the size of the need, but it stopped the hemorrhage. He signed into law a bill against hate crimes back home are on the rise. He then made a move to get a health care bill. At that time, 42 million Americans had no health care. If you had a pre-existing condition, cancer, for example, breast cancer and the like, you couldn't get health insurance or you could lose your job. And that was a big part of his motivation. Well, we got a health care bill after much resistance. It's amazing how much resistance there was to a comprehensive health care bill. But the insurance vested interests are so strong, they fought to remove the public option and to create more competition. The result is today there are 59 million Americans with no health insurance, 59 million. The insurance fees are still rising. He had to bail out the banks because the bank in Ireland, the bank in the banks in France, the big rock in London, a global financial collapse. So bailing out the banks, I thought was necessary, but it should have come at the cost of those who drove us into the hole having to pay some price for driving us into the hole. So no profiting bank president had to pay a price. No board of director had to pay a price. Those Congress folk who were to do the overseeing had to pay no price. And while the stars on a given team may be guy X or guy Y, as the case may be, it's the referee that protects the game's integrity and keeps it from becoming a brawl. Yesterday, France played Ireland in the rigged rugby match. And so you lost, which has some sense of ache because you lost, but you didn't lose your dignity. And France won, they got their honor, and that's now we'll play the next game the next time. But without the referee, the game would have been a brawl. So the overseers of the banks were either doing fundraisers on Wall Street or looking for a job on Wall Street. The overseers let us down. The banks, understandably, pursue maximum profit and greed, but in the absence of overseers, the banks were able to use their power to remove the Glass-Steagall Act so you could do investing and lending on the same roof, and they choose investing and speculation over lending. They were allowed to do that by the overseers. And so we bailed out the banks, but not linked to lending, not linked to reinvestment. So now banks make money off of foreclosures. $4 million more foreclosures this year. Banks make money off originating the loan. They make money off of private mortgage investment. They make money off of foreclosures, and so they still are making money without having to. So a city like Chicago, 100,000 plus homes, abandoned homes or vacant lots, and no plan for lending, reinvestment, reconstruction. And so I'm disappointed in that. There are 49 million Americans now who are in poverty. Went to a home foreclosure, there's a shelter, a homeless shelter about 3 or 4 weeks ago. And these women were basically working class women teaching their children how to read and write and computers at night. But these women had a home two years ago, a job a year ago, but they were working but couldn't pay rent. There are now 44 million Americans on food stamps, and 31 million looking for or don't have a job. And so we, in the last kind of getting together Republicans, we're going to be more civil and we're going to get along. But in that getting along, that no one discussed the word poverty, and it's growing, or economic justice, or racial justice, or home foreclosures, or reconstruction. To me, that's outside of the box and must be in the box.
Okay, can I talk to you specifically about a couple of issues? I'm sure there are people out there who hand it over to the audience in a few minutes, but who will have other issues that they want to raise. But a couple of issues that resonate here and in the United States. You brought up the issue of foreclosures, and Rainbow Push, the organisation for which you have been responsible and with which you've been involved for many, many years now. It's one of their major planks, one of the major planks in your policy. What are you doing within that organisation to attempt to address the issue of foreclosure in the States, because it's an issue that is becoming bigger and bigger in this country?
First of all, we found the banks were targeting, in our instance, by race. If a black or Latino made $100,000 a year, they got subprime high-cost loans. Whites making $50,000 got prime low-cost loans. So they were able to use kind of reverse redlining without penalty. They got bailed out. In spite of that, without the law being enforced, the people locked out. And so banks must not be allowed to avoid community reinvestment. And that's what they were, in fact, were doing, because lack of oversight, lack of honest overseers in the process. It became a kind of economic brawl. We filed lawsuits. Attorney General Lisa Madigan found the banks guilty and fined them. Not nearly enough, but they at least were fined. But our government has not made the banksters pay the price they must pay for driving us in this hole. And now, when I look at so-called bailout, it's prosperity for the bankers and austerity for the poor. The people who are not invited to the party must pay for the party. That does not stand to reason. And so, bank accountability remains an issue with us. We fight it legally, we fight it politically, and now we're trying to create a deal where these banks will be a factor in reinvesting, so all these abandoned homes can become places where people go to work. Vacant homes where their boards need window panes and glazers and painters and brick masons and supplies. We could really turn the minds into a place, but presently there is no plan to stop the foreclosures significantly, not for reconstruction. But it's a fight.
As somebody that obviously you're very familiar with, fellow Chicagoan Rahm Emanuel said, never let a good crisis go to waste. And one of the examples that we have in this country of a government not letting a good crisis go to waste is the issue of the minimum wage. As part of the recovery process, we are experiencing a situation where the minimum wage has been cut by €1 an hour. Do you see the minimum wage as being an essential casualty, if you like, in the process of so-called economic recovery?
Well, when one force says cut minimum wage, we must say raise the livable wage. That must be the tension between livable wage and minimum wage. Now, in the austerity program, by and large, the most able people are cushioned from the impact. And to me, they said, we cut even across the board. That's like ham and egg justice. You walk in the house and ham and eggs are cooking, it smells equal because it's blending, and you hear the sound of the fry. But if you put it on the table, you put a hog there and a chicken, the hog will always vote against a ham and egg sandwich. Hog must drop a leg and can't go any further, total sacrifice. The chicken drops an egg and moves on. Ham and egg justice. So this so-called cut across the board is not even as the language sounds, it's not even. And those who created the crisis must at least extend a rope of hope and not a shovel to dig deeper. When working poor people work, they consume, they spend, they invest in the economy. They buy houses and cars and send children to school. And so we must build our economies bottom up. And those, in fact, who didn't do oversight have not paid a big price. They get defeated sometime. Those who profited from the greed, they've not paid a big price. But those, the poorest, most vulnerable people are paying the price. That's why it's time for mass constructive demonstrations to fight back. You can't just adjust to oppression. You must fight back. And while I support maximum voter turnout on February 25th, that is just one level for change. In Selma, is that the level of change? We need elected officials in that system, but what is Montgomery and the boycott was outside of the system. The Montgomery was outside the system. The sit-ins were outside the system. Mandela and ANC, he didn't have the right to vote, outside the system. In Tunisia, a guy slapped and humiliated, demolishes, he fights back, he sacrifices, outside the system. Those who are marching in Egypt, they're not depending upon the vote in November. They have the power, or person power, to open the system up. And I would urge us to begin to move from whereas I'm unemployed, whereas they've cut my wages, whereas they've cut the safety net, therefore act. When people act, great things come their way when they act. I heard today in a Q&A about not far from here, a group of travelers. Well, 14 families are living in squalor, without adequate running water and toilets and all of that. If this group were to go there in the depth of degradation and protest loudly, the media would come, and social media would come, and allies would come, and politicians would show up, and you'd have change. You're more likely to have a change where the travelers have been violated than just using the vote. The vote, yes. The law, yes. Social media, yes. Marching feet, yes. All these actions are required to bring about the change we seek. All of them matter.
Reverend Jesse Jackson, thank you very much indeed for talking to us.